AMW විකුණු පාන විතරක්ම වෙන්නේ නැති ගන්න.
ඕන වාහනයක් ගන්නවා.
පරණ වාහනයක්
ගන්නවා.
පාර්ට්ස් හැම හොයා ගන්න අමාරු කාර් එකක්
ගන්නවා.
සල්ලි ගන්න විකුණනකන් ඉන්න වෙන්නේ.
පැය 3ෙන් සල්ලි දෙනවා.
ලීසින් කරලා තිබුණොත්
ලීස් එක සෙටල් කරලා අපි ගන්නවා.
කොකටත් එක ෂුවර් කරගන්න හැබැයි.
අපෙන් නොගත්තත් අපි ගන්නවා.
Sri Lanka has had enough. Whether you are a business leader or whether you are an ordinary citizen, everyone has had enough. The economy has been ruined. The business sector is struggling, suffering, in fact crippled from multiple power cuts and at the same time lack of foreign currency. It could be defined as the perfect storm that our business sector and our industries are facing. I'm sure as a citizen of this country, as a CEO, an employee, an executive, a manager, you have had enough as well. Normally, Bisnomics is all about helping you to get to better profitability, and we call it your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. But profit seems to be a distant dream for many businesses, especially small and medium sector enterprises. Our focus today on Bisnomics is about empowering you with insight, making sure that you know what's going on, and hearing from an expert, someone who knows exactly how we have got to this bad situation as a country, as an economy, and what does the future hold for us? Is there any hope at all? Well, your guess may be as good as mine, but let's hear it from an expert on this matter, who is none other than Dr. Roshan Perera, former director of the Central Bank, whom we are welcoming back to Bisnomics today. Dr. Roshan, it's an extreme honor and a pleasure to have you with us again. I hope, compared to our last time, that I was able to invite you to this show at a better time, a time that is better for the people of this country. But as you know, it is not such a time, but still, despite your busy schedule, despite so many difficulties, you are still here with us, and thank you for coming for Bisnomics today.
Thank you, Tharinder, for inviting me once again. It's good to be back at this show.
Dr. Roshan, let's just try to fathom one thing here. How did we get to where we are? I mean, clearly, policy decisions have been made by people who have absolutely no understanding about policy. Business leaders simply are being ignored. They have been repeatedly requesting for various assistance, and we don't see that coming in, and I don't think throwing 5,000 rupees every now and then is the way forward for this country and this economy. How bad is our scenario, and how did we get to where we are? Let's start with that. Let's start by trying to fathom and understand that.
So, Tharindu, I think this problem did not happen overnight. Basically, we have been a country that has been running continuous twin deficits, we call it. Basically, we have been running fiscal deficits and deficits in our external current account right from post-independence period. So, in other words, basically our country has been living beyond our means. We have been spending more than we have been earning, we have been consuming more than we have been producing. But the big problem with this is that it is the government that has really been living beyond its means. Because if it was the private citizens, the private sector that was doing it, and basically that they were running deficits, they would finance it through foreign investments, which is not a bad thing. But unfortunately, in Sri Lanka, these deficits have been created by the government. And how does the government bridge this deficit? They have to borrow. And how has basically there are only two ways in which the government can borrow. The government borrow domestically, or it can borrow from the external sector. Borrowing from the domestic sector, basically what it has done is it has crowded out private investment. So, that is one thing that it has done, and also because it has used monetization of the deficit, which is basically financing the deficit to the banking sector and particularly the central bank, it has meant high inflation. So, we have continuously had high inflationary rates.
And Dr. Roshan, let's openly discuss here. Today, citizens of the country are seeing the central bank more like a public printing press, because we see that money is being printed at a rapid rate. Billions are printed, which are simply unprecedented. Isn't there any limitation stopping them from doing all this money printing?
So, unfortunately, the Monetary Law Act does permit the central bank to to finance a deficit. Now, this is a very good question, because a few years ago there was a new central bank law that was drafted, or a bill. It went to Parliament, it was never actually presented in Parliament, or it did not get approved. And in that law actually, or the bill, there was a limit, or it prevented the central bank from actually financing this deficit through purchasing the treasury bills from the primary auction. Now, that would have been a control on the central bank's financing of deficit. But that is not to say that there are other checks and balances. There are other checks and balances on the central bank financing the deficit, but unfortunately those are not being adhered to at the moment. So, that is why we are seeing this huge financing of the deficit from the central bank. So, that was from the domestic side. But the second issue is basically we also finance the deficit through external sources. So, we borrowed highly from abroad, and because we graduated to middle income status, we lost access to concessionary financing, and we had to borrow through commercial sources. And now we are basically having to repay that, right, because the grace periods on commercial debt are much shorter, the interest rates are much higher. And if you see the debt repayments in the next, like starting from last 2 years ago, it's about $4 to $5 billion every year. So, that's a huge amount of foreign outflows in this country, and we know how much we actually earn through exports, right. So, this is really not a sustainable model that we are following. So, I think that is why we got there. But
the root cause.
The root cause, but actually why the current situation, what has triggered this is basically,
it's an acute situation right now.
Exactly, and that is really the reason why we have come to this level, is because we have not been able to refinance our external debt. So, what happens is countries borrow and they never really expect to repay that debt. We keep trying to roll it over. But what happens is, because we took certain fiscal measures, drastic fiscal measures, cut our taxes, and investors felt that our public finances were not sustainable. They
which is a fair way to see things.
Yes, because we slashed taxes by nearly, we lost nearly 25 to 30% of our tax revenue annually. So, they basically started repricing our debt at huge discounts, which meant that we could not afford to reissue these debts in commercial terms. And also that led to even the sovereign rating agencies downgrading us, right. First we get to CCC, then we went to CC, and basically we are not able to now roll over that debt. So, as a result, what have we had to do? We have had to use the limited reserves, or the limited foreign exchange that we are earning, to continue to sustain this, to repay our debts. So, as a result, we are bleeding our foreign reserves. We are not able to pay for the other, things that are essential commodities. And that is
when
really,
you say essential commodities, we are looking at fuel is an issue, and we hear this term very often, that there is a ship with a load of fuel, but since we are unable to make the payment in dollars, that we are not being able to obtain access to that. Medicine is in short supply, and at the same time some of the imported even food items are not available. Patients are being told that their surgeries are going to be kept on hold because they can't. I mean, we can't think of a time that the economy has been in this bad shape, doctor, in the recent history.
Definitely. So, I think, so as I said, these are the two main reasons why we are in this current situation. So, basically our domestic, so yes, we can say that there are some external factors. We can say COVID did have an impact. We can't deny that. We can say
but all countries face COVID,
exactly.
Not
yes.
only us. I mean,
yes.
Right now it looks like even in entire South Asia, we are, except us, everybody is doing well.
Exactly. So, I mean, by now we should have come out of the COVID situation.
Correct.
But the situation in Sri Lanka is because of this, the unsustainable debt that we have racked up both on the domestic front and at the external front. So, our domestic debt is making inflation basically unbearable, and on the external front we are depleting our reserves, that we are unable to even meet the our essential goods. So, that is really the situation that we are in. So, yeah, soaring inflation, and
we are going to come back to a discussion on inflation in a bit. Let's talk about the dollar situation, Dr. Roshan, because clearly over the last 2 years the dollar reserves of this country have come down drastically by about 70%, and we now see that out of our foreign currency reserves, even by considering gold, etc., still I don't think we are having enough to even meet some of the basic requirements, and that means we see massive queues outside fuel stations, people are unable to get fuel on time, people have to go looking around where can we get fuel and etc. Medicine shortage is looming, and we saw the news about how some of the operations were going to be put on hold, the routinal operations were going to be put on hold. How bad is the dollar reserve situation, number one, and number two, now we see the government after so many years and so much of requests, now they are saying now we are going to float the rupee, and then we saw a sudden shift and some of the black market rates are going at close to 400. Doctor, is it too late that we took this decision to float? So, two questions there. How bad is the dollar reserve situation, and is it it's too little too late in terms of allowing the rupee to float now?
So, Thanu, those are very good questions, and I think we really need to go back a bit actually, maybe about 6 months ago, when the central bank decided to peg the dollar or to keep the dollar, at a fixed exchange rate. So, that started in September. But in order to do that, and they basically fixed the dollar at about, I think buying and selling rates were 197 to 203.
Correct. But I must also add, doctor, that it was very difficult to find dollars at that rate also. Banks will say, though, they say, we can't give you dollars at that. People who wanted to travel couldn't go, importers, export, they all struggled.
Exactly. So, how they try to do that is basically through moral suasion. So, they told the commercial banks, you cannot transact at anything over that rate.
I think the word we can use the word corporate hooliganism to a certain extent, because you are threatening banks and saying don't do this.
Yeah, so basically they were not allowed to sell at anything beyond those rates. Then they also intervened in the foreign exchange market, because they were providing the central bank was providing dollars to particularly for these essential commodities. So, they were intervening in the market, and the other one they had a forced conversion. First they told the commercial banks that they had to convert 10% of their dollars to sell it to the central bank, and then it was upped gradually. So, because of all of that, basically they tried to maintain that, but what was it?
And exporters were told they had to convert their dollars as well.
Exactly. So, they had to sell to the commercial banks, and through that they had to sell it to the central bank. But we know what the end result was, right? So, the central bank basically lost $4 to $5 billion of reserves as a result of trying to maintain this peg.
And that included the dollar income from the businesses as well as the foreign remittances, because people were saying that they were not going to send money when they are not getting a fair rate.
Yes. So, in addition to that, we lost that as well.
Correct.
So, we lost the inflows.
It's a double hit.
Yeah. And also it resulted in a parallel black market, right? Parallel exchange market that, and as you said, the premiums just skyrocketed. So, I mean, that is basically the background to it. So, why did the central bank suddenly go and float the dollar, or the rupee rather? What happened was basically they ran out of reserves. There was no way that they could maintain this peg. So, suddenly overnight they decide to float the exchange rate. But that was also, they just let go of the fixed exchange rate, but they did not really address the root cause, and the root cause is really this huge ballooning trade deficit and the balance of payments deficit really that the country was facing. So, this was a recipe for disaster, and as you know, in the curb market now the rupee has gone up to 400 rupees. So, really what was the problem? The problem is there was no proper sequencing. There should have been a proper sequencing of, okay, we have held the dollar for the rupee for 6 months. Now, when we let it go, but there must have been a proper sequencing. So, one of the things is basically there should have been a backstop. There should have been some kind of arrangement either with IMF or with the bilateral lenders that, okay, we have, even though the country may not have reserves, we have this backstop where we can go to in the event that we are not able to meet these obligations. We did not go there. There is still not enough clarity whether we are going to the IMF, when we are going to the IMF,
and we had a time where sometimes where two key figures who are leading this economy, one was saying we are going to the IMF, the other one is saying no, we are not going to the IMF. Even they themselves seemed not to be so sure, doctor.
So, exactly. So, that creates a lot of uncertainty in the minds of people, and particularly people, in terms of worker remittances. If you are able to instill the confidence in your market, in your currency, then you would see the inflows coming in. The exporters will bring their proceeds, the workers will send in their remittances, but that did not happen. So, that was definitely one thing. So, I think urgently that IMF program, there needs to be clarity that we are going to this IMF program, and so that will give some confidence. But in the meantime, this IMF program is going to take time to negotiate. So, we need in the meantime, we need to have some bridge financing, and I think okay, we are doing some of that. We are approaching our bilateral lenders and other multilateral lenders to give us some bridge financing, because we are in I mean, our reserves are down to the bottom really. We are scraping the barrel, right? So, we need to do that.
We are going to come back to you on more details on that after break. What exactly will be the terms and conditions that might possibly be there in an IMF agreement? Let's talk about that on the other side of this short break. This is Bisnomics. Welcome back to Bisnomics. We are in conversation with Dr. Roshan Perera in order to understand how exactly did our economy go so bad, what were the key policy mistakes, and most importantly, if there is any hope in the way forward, what would that be? What needs to be done? Because it's time that the business leaders understood this and came forward as one and made sure that the economy was set in the right course, because this is our nation, it's our economy, and we desperately need this to be done. Dr. Roshan, in terms of the IMF, now we could see the IMF idea was being talked at in so many different forums, especially political forums, but it was very clear that most of those comments, they had no proper understanding about what this was going to be. But if you look at the IMF, and right now it seems to be like that silver bullet, it's appearing to be that one thing that will take all the miseries of our economy out, and that we will be saved. But to what extent will the IMF get involved, and how do they get involved? We hear that recently there was a message that they were going to have a discussion about a loan being provided. Are they going to restructure the debt of our country? So, if and when IMF gets involved, what can they do? Loans, restructuring, and what would their conditions probably be? Because there has been a letter issued by them as well in terms of some of the basic discussions that have been carried out. I am sure you have seen some of that information. Tell us, doctor, what's going to be the way forward if IMF gets involved?
So, firstly I have to say that IMF, actually there was an Article 4 consultation. So, they do this in every country every year. They did an Article 4 consultation in December, and they handed the report to the authority. So, basically to the central bank and to the Ministry of Finance. This was in December, and in that report, which we now have access to, basically they have indicated that the debt is unsustainable, that we really need to do that. So, now this is 4 months ago, or at least 3 months ago. My question is, what did we do with that report? What did the authorities do with that report? Did anybody read it? Wasn't it people aware of, or the authorities aware of what needed to be done? Because if we were aware of what needed to be done, the first thing we would have had to do, we needed to do, was to do a debt restructuring. And to do that, we had to basically say, okay, we are going to stop payment of our debts, a debt standstill. That would have been the immediate thing in December. But we come today to March, I mean we are in April, we still don't see that. We are still paying, our debt repayments are still being paid. So, even last week, you know, we paid the bondholders. There was a coupon payment. We paid the bondholders, which was about $56 million. And now we are trying to find $52 million to
get the
fuel out of the ship that is now parked there. And people are, so what were we doing? What are we doing really? So, I think that is the first thing that we will have to do, because the IMF will not get involved until we start this process, because they are not going to lend to a country that is not able to repay, because they are giving money and they are answerable to their own shareholders, or their, the governance, the board of governors. So, the only way that they will come into an agreement or a negotiation with the government is if we go into a debt restructuring program. So, that is number one. We have to start that. Only then can we start negotiating with the IMF. And when if you read that report carefully, you will find that many of the observations that the IMF have made, the recommendations that the IMF have made, are not very different to what the local or domestic economists have been making for the last 1 to 1.5 years.
Correct.
They are very standard recommendations. A fiscal consolidation needs to be done. We need to address the losses in the SOEs. We need to have tighter monetary policy. We need to have a I mean, all those recommendations are almost the same really. So, my question again is really, weren't the authorities aware of these problems before? Because the central bank, I think they in their Monetary Law Act, they are supposed to address, you know, the any instability that is
Correct.
in the macroeconomic arena. So, and I'll quote specific sections in the Monetary Law. So, there is a section 64 in the Monetary Law Act which talks about domestic stabilization. And there they say if inflation goes above 10% of 10%, that they need to submit a report to the Minister of Finance stating what are the reasons for the increase in this inflation and what are the measures that they have already taken to address that, and what measures need to be taken either by them or the authorities to address this situation. So, weren't those things done? Because inflation has been over 10% since last year, end of last year.
Correct.
Same with the external stabilization. There is a section 65, 66 which talks of external stabilization, and where if the reserves or the exchange rate of basically the central bank has to make sure that the exchange rate is in line with the underlying macroeconomic factors in the economy. So, if they realize that that was not happening, and I am saying that the technical experts in the central bank have all the expertise, they have the education, the qualifications, everything very much similar to anyone in the IMF or any of the domestic other macroeconomists. So, they would have known these things. But then what did the authorities do with those reports? Because these reports were submitted to the Minister of Finance on a regular basis. And if they have not, of course, it's a violation of these sections in the Monetary Law Act, and I don't think the central bank violates those. They would have submitted this. But then what actually happened with those reports? Weren't those taken seriously? Why are we waiting till the IMF tells us to do 1, 2, 3, 4 to actually even set about doing these things? So, that's a question I would have in terms of what needs to be done and why haven't we done that all this time?
It's a valid question indeed. And what do you think, if and when IMF does commit and set up the support program, what will some of those conditions be? Are we looking at reductions of the state sector? Are we looking at tax increases? What can we expect, Doctor? I know we can't exactly and precisely presume that, but in your view, in your experience and seeing what they have done in programs around the world, such as in Pakistan and so on, what are we expecting?
So, I think one thing is very clear, because I started the program by saying that the root cause is really the fiscal deficit,
Yes.
right. So, they and I think we all agree that it has to be a revenue centered fiscal consolidation. So, we really need to increase taxes.
So, there's no more room to cut down costs?
No, I mean expenditure, if you look at our expenditure as a total, is not very different to others. In fact, it's probably less sometimes than some of even our peer countries. Of course, within expenditure, there can be a reallocation of expenditure.
Correct.
I mean, why do we need to be building roads at the moment? We don't even have cars and we don't even have the fuel to drive on those roads. We can cut down that expenditure and maybe transfer it to some other areas.
Correct.
And I'll talk about some of those areas that I think we need to increase expenditure. But definitely revenue consolidation, and I think the first thing we need to do is at least go back to the taxes we had in 2019. That's
Correct.
a bare minimum, because there we lost something like $500 to $600 billion rupees every year. So, that's 2020 and 2021, and now 2022, if we don't do anything and we haven't for the first 3 months, we are continuing to lose that revenue, right. So, that has to be done. The other one is we have to arrest the losses in the SOEs. We know that the CPC and CEB have been racking up huge losses, and that is because, I mean, we kind of were very complacent when fuel prices were low, and we had very good rain in the last 2 years. So, we were not that worried about fuel pricing.
I do have a question there, Doctor. And I mean, if you look at 2020 and 2021, oil was at a near zero. Weren't they forward thinking enough to buy the required oil, knowing very well that in the drought months we need oil to generate more of our electricity? Weren't they forward thinking enough? Wasn't the government forward thinking enough to buy that oil and keep? Number one. And number two, if you look at something like the CEB that you mentioned, now they have been making losses, yes, but the people are saying nobody got electricity free of charge. No, we were paying for our electricity. So, then it clearly shows that some people have been enjoying electricity without paying as well. which is a sad state, because we do hear about some of the people's representatives, how millions of rupees of electricity has not been paid. So clearly there is a governance issue also here beyond the economic issue.
Yes, so to get to your first point, basically, why did we buy forward? Now there we have a problem, we have a legacy problem, because we tried to do buying forward, the hedging deals and the fiasco with that.
Correct.
But that doesn't mean that it's a bad thing to do.
Correct.
It's just that we need to have the expertise, and that is a problem actually.
Right people making the right decisions.
And also within those institutions, I mean, these are some of the largest institutions in the country. You need to have very good financial experts in those positions, making those decisions, because they need to be able to understand what is a hedging deal, what kind of, and to make sure that we don't go into the, make the same kind of mistakes that we did in the past. So that is one. Second one is we need to have storage capacity. Again, there are issues there. And if we have those in place, yes, as you said, we could have bought forward and we may not be facing these problems like we are now. So that needs to be addressed. In terms of electricity, now the issue with electricity is we have not revised tariffs since 2014. That is 7 years we have gone like this. I think recently the chairman of the CEB basically said that the average tariff on electricity is something like 16%, 16 rupees, sorry. The cost is something like 30 rupees, because now we are having to generate more in terms of thermal generation, which is high cost, whereas hydro is much
lower now these
lower
days.
cost. Yeah, so the
And
average
I believe
cost is
that
30.
certain plants, like for example the Sampur, the coal-based electricity, now due to environmental concerns, yes, it was stopped, but at the same time, coal is a much more cheaper source of energy as well, Doctor. So clearly, there have been now. Once everything is stable, maybe we could look at actually some of these aspects of balancing out some of these effects. But clearly, there has been like a lot of mismatches in some of the decisions that have been made, especially in the power sector.
Definitely. So definitely there has been in terms of the energy mix and in the supply of energy as well. I mean, there are you really have to have good management in terms of how much you're going to, the energy mix in good times, and then knowing that there is a drought and how you're going to manage your energy mix. But I also think that you need to adjust some of these prices, because who's benefiting from these subsidies? It's mainly the people who have air conditioning, or who are the businesses who use more of the
Correct.
power. So we really need to adjust that. We need to address that. So that's one. And I think the other thing is, I mean, immediately, why can't we even impose an electricity surcharge? We did this in the 1990s, right? When we had huge power generation problems, we had an immediate electricity surcharge. So people who were, so you don't affect the people at the bottom of the pyramid, but or people who are, consuming a low amount of energy. But anybody who's consuming higher than that has to pay a surcharge. So I mean, there are very quick things that can be done, but it seems that everything is kind of stalling and taking time, and this is causing huge problems, because the CEB and CPC are racking massive losses.
Correct.
Which ultimately the impact is on the banks, because their losses are basically they are borrowing from the banks in order to
especially
fund their
states, a lot of state sector banks.
And we know the problem with that, because that is going to have an impact on their profitability, on their sustainability, or the financial stability. So I mean, these have to be looked at holistically. You can't look at one aspect only. You have to look at it as a whole.
And it seems to me like it's a hot potato, and so many government authorities are very happy to play passing the pillow with this hot potato, because at some point this ticking time bomb is going to explode, Doctor. And I mean, the worst thing we can think of is amidst these problems, if some large state banks also go, if they are facing liquidity issues, that will be a massive problem after that.
So definitely, I mean, the government, I mean, that is one thing that we really need to avoid at all costs, because we can talk about sovereign debt crises, or we can have balance of payments crisis, but I think we really need to avoid even thinking about going into a financial crisis or a banking crisis, because the cost on the economy will be much greater and much more widespread than
especially when you put the ATM cards, if the money is not coming out, I think that will be a new level of crisis that a lot of Sri Lankans will not tolerate, even as they are already tolerating quite a lot now, Doctor. We are going to continue the discussion, especially on some of the Ukraine and Russia war related matters as well. Stay tuned. We will be back after this short break. This is Bisnomics.
AMW එකෙන් අපි ඕන වාහනයක් ගන්නවා.
පොඩ්ඩක් ඉන්න AMW විකුණු පාන විතරක්ම වෙන්නේ නැති ගන්නේ.
ඕන වාහනයක් ගන්නවා.
පරණ වාහනයක්
ගන්නවා.
අම්බාලකට දුවපු වාහනයක් නම්
මයිලේජ් ජෙනුයින් නම් ගන්නවා.
පාර්ට්ස් එහෙම හොයාගන්න අමාරු කාර් එකක්
අවුලක් නෑ ගන්නවා.
සෑහෙන්න මොඩිෆයි කරපු එකක්.
කිසි ප්‍රශ්නයක් නෑ.
සල්ලි ගන්න විකුණනකන් ඉන්න වෙයිනේ.
පැය 3ෙන් සල්ලි දෙනවා.
එතකොට ලීසින් කරලා තිබුණොත්
ලීස් එක සෙටල් කරලා අපි ගන්නවා.
කොකටත් එක ෂුවර් කරගන්න හැබැයි.
AMW වෙතින් ඕනෑම වාහනයක් කරදරයක් නැතුව විකුණ ගන්න. අපෙන් නොගත්තත් අපි ගන්නවා.
Welcome back to Bisnomics. We are in conversation with Dr. Roshan Perera, former director of the central bank, on the current state of the economy. How did it come to a situation this bad? What were the authorities thinking of? These are questions that Sri Lankans need answers for, and that's exactly what we hope to deliver to you today. Dr. Roshan, let's talk also about the Ukraine and Russia war, because clearly there is a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Things are not going that great on that front, and globally this creates an issue because Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, this is seen as the world's bread basket, with more than 30% of wheat coming of the world coming from this region. But at the same time, Russia is also one of our key buyers for our tea, for our spices, and Ukraine and Russia both are two key tourist destinations for us as well. How is this really affecting the Sri Lankan economy?
Yes, so in addition to all that we have spoken about,
correct.
This is going to have this is having a knock-on effect, because basically we can see oil prices have just risen. I mean, since 2014 we have not seen oil prices go above $100 a barrel.
Correct.
The Brent crude oil prices. So that has had a huge impact, obviously, on our domestic fuel, and that's one of the reasons why we are facing these huge balance of payment issues,
Correct.
the widening of the trade deficit, as well as now the inability to pay for our for our oil imports. But apart from that, and gas is also similar, right?
Correct.
Because they are a huge producer of gas and a supplier of gas. But as you said, I think, and wheat also, I think, as you said, they are 30% of the world's producers, but I think we import about 50% of our wheat comes from Russia and the Ukraine, or from that region. So not only will wheat prices increase, globally what we are going to see is also rice prices, because they are close substitutes. Prices are going to increase, and we know the problem that we are going to face because of this fertilizer issue.
Yes.
We are going to have to import rice, which means that we are going to have to pay higher price on account of that. So that's going to have another knock-on impact on this country. But apart from that, those are from the outflow side. For the inflows, as you said, tea is a huge, I mean, Russia is probably the second largest export destination for tea. So how are we going to get that, the same issue we faced
and already
when
due to the fertilizer issue, especially I think one could say due to many short-sighted policies, doctor. But we see that if you take the fertilizer issue, we already know that how some of our other key markets, like for example Turkey, Iran, they are now moving towards tea made in India. They are moving towards the Kenyan tea. This is whammies we are getting whacked in with from all sides, out of the pot right into the fire.
So it's a shame, because actually if you see, exports have really improved in much of the world.
Correct.
In fact, there are supply chain disruptions or shortages. So we really should have been
able to capitalize on that.
Exactly. So I think this is a real unfortunate situation that we are not producing enough tea.
Correct.
So that is going to have a huge impact, and the other one is tourism. We've had a very bad 2 years, and now tourism was just picking up. And I think in this year, if you look at the tourist arrivals, most were from that region, which is going to be hugely impacted because of the war situation. I mean, we have not yet seen the numbers, but obviously there is going to be an impact on that. So Sri Lanka is really going to have quite a big impact from this from the war.
This is what we call a rock and a hard place.
Exactly. So if these tensions are ongoing, and if it's going to keep going, there are definitely going to be knock-on effects on Sri Lanka.
Dr. Roshan, let's talk about inflation. Affects you, affects me, affects everyone who is watching this show. And safe to say that starting from the kings to the paupers, everyone gets affected by inflation, and especially those who are living at middle and lower income categories. They are seeing their income, the real income is diminishing, what they can buy with their income is diminishing, and their dreams also are diminishing. How bad is our inflation situation? I believe we are among the one of the worst in the region and worst in the world right now. And the bigger question is, are we the next Venezuela and Zimbabwe?
So, well, I hope we're not. But if you look at inflation, I mean, yes, we know that inflation is rising across the world. But Sri Lanka's inflation is affected by many factors, not only global factors. The March figures were just out. Inflation is has gone up to 18.7%. Food inflation has risen to 30%.
30%.
30%.
And I believe
year on year.
the inflation among the items found in supermarkets, which is supermarkets are no longer a luxury institution, doctor. It's what normally even some of the lower middle class and even the middle class, upper middle, they all go there. I believe that the prices in supermarkets have gone up by more than 36%.
Exactly. So, I mean, and this is not only due to global factors. We have had domestic factors.
Correct.
I think we talked about it earlier, right? Food production, because of the fertilizer issue, and that is going to bite us in the future, because going forward, because in the next harvest is going to be even hugely affected by the shortage of fertilizer. So, we are going to see inflation rising even further. We have this exchange rate depreciation. I mean, so far this year, the exchange has depreciated by something nearly 50%. So, that is going to have the pass-through effect of the exchange rate through the import commodities is going to have a knock-on effect on inflation. The removal of administrative prices. We know we can't continue to have these administrative prices, because they are creating shortages, they are creating issues, losses in the SOEs. So, the administrative prices are gradually being dismantled, but that is going to have an immediate impact on inflation. And of course, the big issue is the money supply. And I think that is where the central bank and in this country, we have had a huge monetization of the deficit, which has increased the demand, money supply, that as well as the reduction in taxes, which has increased the aggregate demand, it has created excess aggregate demand. So, there is a huge amount of demand created, which is also inflating prices. And I think the point that you made is quite correct. Inflation really affects the poor, because it's a tax on the poor.
Correct.
Because they cannot hedge against inflation, because they keep their money mainly in cash or maybe in deposits, which there is no hedge against inflation.
I mean, imagine your bank is paying you like a 8% or a 10% interest, whereas your inflation is going up by 18% almost every month.
Exactly. Yeah, so you're basically negative interest rates. You're losing money really.
Correct.
Whereas the rich can hedge against, and they are hedging against. They are
Yes.
buying assets. So again, so there, as you said, we really need to. There has to be decisive measures. And you talked about Venezuela and hyperinflation. I mean, we cannot allow ourselves
But Doctor,
to get to that.
aren't we getting precariously close to situations of hyperinflation?
I hope not, and I think that the central bank and the authorities need to take very strong measures to ensure that we bring down our money supply. And to do that, we really have to raise interest rates. Interest rates have to go up much further. You were talking about interest rates, the gap between rates and inflation. So the interest rates have to go up higher than inflation, so that we have real interest rates and we can bring down this money supply, so that we can address this inflation. But of course, there is always a lag. You raise interest rates today, there is a lag in how it feeds through to inflation. So it has to be done now. We can't wait, wait any longer to take these policy actions. They must be taken immediately.
Doctor, when we talk about the current scenario, especially in the past few days, we've seen lots of protests. Doctor, these are not people who are coming, most of these people, I would say a massive majority, are not people who are coming to protest because of their allegiances to a particular political party. You know that, I know that ordinary Sri Lankans are now getting onto the roads. They are protesting, they are fighting, and they are demanding not for anything else to have not to destroy this country, this economy any further, and to put it on the right track, because as long as the fundamental economic factors are in play, we know Sri Lankans are very resilient. Sri Lankans have been fighting hard. This is a country that experienced a war that spread over 3 decades. People still fought on, kept their businesses alive, and they were looking forward to a new era of growth in the economy, Doctor. And you would have seen the pictures as much as I did. there were mothers in those protests holding their babies. Clearly these are not people who are coming for money or coming for political reasons. These are ordinary Sri Lankan citizens of our country who are desperate, and their desperation clearly shows that things have gone from bad to worse almost on a month by month basis. These are not extremists, these are not terrorists, these are Sri Lankans, these are citizens who actually care for this country, care for an economy, because they all want a country for their children into the future. But that also shows that this desperation comes from the fact that there is no safety nets for them. There are no societal or social economic safety nets, hardly any savings maybe. The savings are getting eroded due to inflation. If you have been saving money to buy a house or a vehicle, you can't afford it anymore. Your second-hand vehicles or used vehicles are going at what used to go at about 2-3 million, doctor, are now going close to 8 to 9 million. They are seeing their dreams getting diminished every day as we speak. How bad is the situation with regard to the lack of safety nets among people, and where will this ultimately end up in?
Poverty has been increasing. There are records of that. During the COVID period, poverty increased. Now with this current situation, because of all this, the current economic crisis, poverty is going to be increasing further. So we really need to be mindful of that. At the moment, we are using poverty indices which are calculated, or the identification of poverty, the people who are poor, which is based on a 2016 survey. We don't even know today who has fallen below the poverty line, what is the poverty line. So we need to be very aware of that. The other one is we need to, you talked about the small and medium businesses. They are hugely affected by this, particularly the electricity supply shortages, the fuel shortages. They are going to not be able to carry on their businesses. They need to be protected. And the other one is youth unemployment. I mean, we have a huge problem with youth unemployment. Nobody realizes that. In the third quarter, we have data only for up to third quarter last year, youth unemployment was something like 30%. So we have the Samurdhi program. It is quite a widespread program, but it's not. Is it adequate in this current context? Is it adequate? Is it actually covering the bottom? Everybody who is falling into poverty. That is the first thing. I think what we really need to.
Do we have any numbers, doctor? How many people are living below the poverty line?
So as I said, the poverty line we are using is something that has come from 2016. In 2019, we did the household income and expenditure survey, but we don't know the details from that. And the poverty line that has been calculated, that is really does not reflect today's prices. So I think that is the first thing that we need to do. And the second one is, of course, we need to have a cash transfer system, because that is with better targeting and better the correct amount that people will need to be able to live a proper life, or at least the basics, be able to afford the basics. And the other one is, of course, unemployment insurance, because we know that people are going to fall into poverty, be unemployed. But the question is, okay, how are we going to pay for it, because we are saying the government doesn't have the money. And that's why I think the people who can afford have to pay their taxes, or pay higher taxes really. So we have to have a very good progressive tax system. The other one is we need to, as I said, we need to transfer expenditure. Do we need more roads? Can't we transfer some of that expenditure into this? Because we know we need to protect these people, right? And the other one is, of course, we need to remove the subsidies on fuel, electricity, which are disproportionately benefiting the rich.
Correct.
And this is very important, because under the IMF program or any program, we are going to have a very strong macro stabilization program. That is going to have the kind of program that we will have to have. We'll have, there will be policy adjustments which will have obviously an impact on the low income, disproportionate impact on the low income. We need to protect them, and actually even the IMF in their document, in their report, have highlighted that there really needs to be protection of the low income and the poor. So I think we need to take cognizance of that, and we need to make sure that we have this in place before we even go into this IMF program.
Dr. Roshan Perera, thank you so much for coming forward, spending your time. Nowadays, a lot of people don't want to even speak about this because there's so much of negativity, but I think not talking about the problem is never the solution to a problem. And I hope that the right authorities would have been listening to what you have to say, and they'll get some sense knocked into them, and they'll take the right necessary steps to make sure that our economy, because we have a beautiful country, we have resilient people, but there's only so much they can do when the right policy frameworks are not in place. And I think now we may have already gone beyond the point of no return, but it's still never too late to turn back and come to the right track as a country, as an economy. Thank you so much for coming forward and sharing your thoughts. It was a pleasure to have you and wish you all the best.
Thank you, Tarun. It was good to be here.
We hope today's Bisnomics episode showed you the insights on where our economy is, what went wrong, and most importantly, I sincerely hope that the right authorities, officials of the right establishments were listening to the insights shared. Already it might be a little too late, but we are never too late to turn back, come into the right course of action. End of the day, we all have one country. Let's make sure we build the economy and take things in the right direction, and the ordinary citizens are no longer having to suffer due to poor decisions made by various authorities. Because as I said at the start, Sri Lanka has had enough. I'm Tharindra Amarasekara, and I will see you with the next episode. No matter what industry you may be in, I hope that you will find success and the courage to keep going, because the nation truly needs it.
අංකල් සැම්සන් එයාගේ කාරක විකුණන්න තීරණය කළා. ඇඩ් එක දැම්ම විතරයි. සට ගාලා කට්ටිය එන්න ගත්තා. හැබැයි සතුටින් හිටපු අංකල් සැම්සන්ට වාහන විකුණන එක එපා වුණා. AMW වෙතින් කරදරයක් නැතුව විකුණ ගන්න. අපෙන් නොගත්තත් අපි ගන්නවා.